now I just want to give an introduction to Bob Whiting, our guest. Give a little quick bio on him for those of you who don't know his background. And just real quick, put you in the spotlight so everyone can see you. Hey, Bob. And I'm going to go through a little bio here. So Bob was born in New Jersey, raised in Eureka, California, which is true Northern California, unlike where I am in Cupertino, which we call Northern California. But that's a pretty rural area, which means it was quite a change when in 1962 he enlisted in the Air Force and was sent to Tokyo. He chose, oh, let me, you guys could mute, please. I'd appreciate that. I'll just mute everyone right now. How about that? There we go. All right, so after his Air Force stint, he enrolled in Sophia University in Tokyo and became an encyclopedia editor, if I'm not mistaken. That first stint lasted 10 years in Japan. And then he moved to New York, where he wrote The Chrysanthemum and the Bat, Baseball Samurai Style. The book was the first of its kind. It described the Japanese national character through baseball. Time magazine named it its sports book of the year. More importantly, it set the groundwork for Bob to become the most renowned English language author in Japanese baseball. And I'll add here on behalf of the JapanBall community, can you please re-release that book for all of us? Thank you. And The Chrysanthemum and the Bat kind of launched Whiting into a full-time baseball writer. He wrote a bunch of columns for Japanese publications and newspapers, but of course we all know him for You Gotta Have Law, which came out in 1989. I'm guessing probably at least 3/4, if not more, of the people on this call have read that book. So I won't talk too much about that, but it of course received much acclaim, was nominated for Pulitzer Prize. And then I just learned how, one thing that's interesting is that it's a staple in lots of academic and even some political institutions. Bob has done a ton of other books, Tokyo Underworld, The Meaning of Ichiro, but of course the most recent one is Tokyo Junkie, 60 Years of Bright Lights and Back Alleys in Baseball. We're going to talk a little bit about that book today. And it's a memoir that I really couldn't recommend enough. If you haven't picked up a copy yet, it kind of captures the parallel journeys of Bob's 60 years in Japan and the 60 years of Tokyo, or 60 years in Tokyo specifically, off and on at least, and Tokyo's growth over that same time. It's an awesome book with characters and history and lots of baseball too. So, you know, Bob's influence and contributions to the English-speaking community of Japanese baseball fans are immeasurable, and I think I'll speak for a lot of us here. And I say thank you for encouraging our interest and knowledge of Japanese version of baseball. And thank you also for joining us today. So that's my long intro, but good to see you, Bob. I muted you while we were talking, so now you got to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Well, thanks. Thank you very much for that kind introduction.
You're welcome.
I recognize a lot of names on the list here. There's Leon, Marty Keener, Sanjay Ora, Scott Molesky, Eureka.
Yeah, we got a great community here of like-minded people, curious and adventurous baseball fans. Linda, thanks for the compliment. It's my mom's painting, Linda. Okay, so we'll start with the questions. And like I said, if you have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand now, and I'll get to them soon. But I want to just start going all the way back to 1962. You dropped off into Tokyo from Humboldt State University in Eureka, California. What were those first days and weeks like? And when did you begin to envision maybe a long-term future in Japan?
Oh, wow. Well, you know, my first impression of Tokyo was just total chaos. They're tearing the city apart and putting it back together for the Olympics one day. And the crowds were enormous. They had a train going into Tokyo Station. There were platform pushers. The trains got so crowded at rush hour time. They had, people in JNR uniforms pushing people into the cars because the doors wouldn't close otherwise. Construction was everywhere. You could stand on one side of the street. It seemed anywhere in Tokyo, there'd be a building being torn down, and across the street there'd be one put up. It was just, you stayed in the city overnight. You had to, you needed black curtains to block out the construction lights because they're all over the city, all night. It's 24 hours a day construction. And you needed earplugs because of the pile drivers and the heavy machinery that was going on all night. They were tearing up the streets and building new subways. And they had put up 8 expressways, 10,000 new buildings. When Japan got the bid in 1958, there was only one 5-star hotel, and that was the Imperial. It was falling into disrepair. They put up 5 new ones, including the Okuda, Otani, and the Hilton. They had there were only narrow roads and low buildings. So the Otani at 17 stories was the tallest building in Tokyo. The infant mortality rate was high. There were rats everywhere. The average life expectancy of a Japanese was 62 years old. Now it's around 85, I think, 86. So in that span, by the time the Olympics had started, they put up 8 overhead expressways. It finished most of them anyway. 10,000 new buildings, 5 5-star hotels, a monorail going from Haneda International Airport into the city, and the bullet train, the Shinkansen, the fastest train in the world, which cut the time to Osaka 300 miles away in half. So it was really a dramatic transformation. And I use the term Tokyo junkie, and one of the reasons is the city was addicted. There's something about, you have all this energy in the air. It really addicts you to it. You just don't want to leave it. I mean, it's just electric atmosphere. And plus the fact that, Tokyo had more bars and restaurants per square kilometer than any other city in the world. You couldn't get them all because by the time you finished, there'd be a whole new group of bars and restaurants that had sprung up. And it was just exciting. In the span of 6 years, Japan went from a polluted backwater that hardly anybody wanted to visit to this high-tech megalopolis that everybody wanted to visit, and became the location for the James Bond film, You Only Live Twice. Tourism spiked, and this city went on this enormous, city and the country went on this enormous economic expansion that lasted for over a decade, right into the trade disputes with the United States and Europe. So it was just so exciting. And, my enlistment expired at the beginning of 1965, and I couldn't imagine leaving. I just couldn't. It was like asking a heroin junkie to give up his drug. I guess a bit extreme, but it was, I just couldn't imagine going back to the States because it was just so, it was such a knockout place. And of course I stayed. I worked for a Japanese company, Encyclopedia Britannica. It was they were selling encyclopedias, but it was a Japanese company. It was owned by more than 50% Japanese ownership, and I worked for all Japanese. I worked with Japanese staff, and my boss was Japanese. And I just got, I was hanging out with gangsters, which is another long story. And they come by my second floor apartment in Higashi Nakano. They come on the street outside and yell my name at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd actually get out of bed and go drinking with them. And so it just reached a point where I had to get back and I had to get away. And also, I wanted to see what I was made of. I'd never really had to, pit myself against my fellow Americans. So I wanted to see what I was capable of. So I moved to New York. There's no place on earth that can make you feel less important than New York City. That's where I went. But it all worked out in the end because I wound up writing Chrysanthemum back and everything changed.
Wow.
Sorry, long answer, short question.
No, that's great. So during that time, before you moved to New York and wrote the book, what was your exposure to Japanese baseball?
Well, in the beginning, I couldn't speak. The only thing I could understand on television was Japanese baseball. They had a Yomiuri Giants game on every night, whether they were at home or on the road. It was broadcast nationwide from 7 to 9. And, a lot of the words were in English, or English-derived words like, home run, safe, alto, bodu, kababo for curveball. And there were a couple of Americans on each team. And I remember Jim Marshall done blasting game, Darryl Spencer, people, who had major league careers whose names I knew growing up in California. And so that made it interesting too. And so I started to read they have sports dailies in Japan. There's several of them, like the Nikkan Sports. It's a broadsheet and it has a circulation of 1 million. So I used to get up in the morning and buy a copy and take my dictionary and go to a coffee shop and try to read an article. And, like one headline would say, Oen Abeku, and Abeku would be in katakana. Oen Abeku home run, Kyojin kachimashita. And that means that O and Nagashima, the two big stars of the Yomiuri Giants, hit home runs and the Giants won. And Abeku would be written in katakana, and I discovered that came from the French word avec, which means with. So O and Abeku means they each hit home runs. They hit home runs together with each other. And then you'd see the kanji characters, the Chinese characters for Kyojin, which would be big and person. It's another way of saying giants. And kachimashita, the character for win. And so and then I would read the article and the quotes. And so that's how I learned to read Japanese. I learned to speak it. And you could walk into a bar any night of the week during baseball season, or restaurant or izakaya, and strike up a conversation with somebody just by saying, how are the Giants doing? Because everybody was watching. Every place you went in had a TV on the wall. So you could make friends with Japanese by, asking, did the Giants win today? Did O hit a home run? That sort of thing. And then it was quite enjoyable. And so that's how I learned to read Japanese. I learned to speak it, and then later on, I learned that I put 2 and 2 together and realized that you could see the value system that went into Japanese baseball was the same value system that was used in the school system and the corporations, the sumo world, even the Yakuza underworld. This whole idea of endless training, development of spirit, total dedication, obedience, self-sacrifice. You saw it everywhere. So that's what led to Chrysanthemum and the Bat.
I read that there was something to do with a bet in that book. Can you talk about that?
Well, when I moved to New York, I didn't think I was ever going to go back to Tokyo. I thought I was just going to stay in New York. find a job somewhere. People would ask me what Tokyo was like, and I would talk about the political system or the labor unions, the salary, and the university. My major was political science, so those were the subjects I knew about. But nobody was interested. When I started telling them about Sadahado O, who would practice every night with a sword, samurai sword, slicing strips of paper suspended from the ceiling in half. Something which is very hard to do. You have to break your wrist at just a hard time because the force of the air from the swing of the sword blows the paper out of the way. And now they would have drills, like they would start spring training right after New Year's in freezing cold, and they had a drill called the 1,000 fungo drill, that you fielded ground balls until you drop from exhaustion 2 or 3 hours later, which is not a fielding drill or a conditioning drill, but a drill to develop spirit. And how this all originated from the martial arts in the 19th century. And it's a philosophy that Japanese applied to all imported Western sports, rugby, soccer. They all approach it the same way as baseball. And this, so if you played baseball in junior high school or college, junior high school or college, you had to play it all year. It wasn't just a spring and summer sport like it was in the States. You played and practiced 365 days a year. You had to dedicate yourself completely to it. It was several hours a day training. And so I would tell people these stories. And I lived on the Upper West Side, 82nd and Central Park West. And there was all the people that I associated with in that neighborhood were involved in publishing. It seemed, editorial assistants, whatever. Fairly, young people, but they pushed me to write this book. They said, "Oh, this is a great way to see the national character of Japan." And I was reluctant to do it because I had never written anything before, and it just seemed like a overwhelming task to actually sit down and write a book. And so then this one guy, after he kept bugging me, and then finally he said, "Well, I guess you don't have what it takes, do you, Whiting, to write a book?" And that's what did it. I said, "Okay, I'll bet you $500 that I'll have a book done within a year." It just pissed me off so much that he said that. And so I went to Barnes and Noble and got a book on how to write nonfiction. And then 6 months later, I had a draft.
Do you have $500 too?
I got my $500, and I finished it within a year, and I actually got it published after being turned down by 14 or 12 publishers in New York.
Wow. I
finally got a contract. I took it to, I said, well, maybe I can get a chapter published. And so I went to Sports Illustrated. And this young woman who was an editor there looked at it and called me back, and she said, "We want this second chapter, chapter 2. We think it's really good." And she said, "I know you're having a hard time selling this book and getting a contract. So why don't you go talk to this guy over at Dodd and Mead, tell him Patricia Ryan sent you, and that Sports Illustrated has purchased first serialization rights." That was on a Friday, and by Monday I had a contract. And that woman, she was my age at the time, but she went on to become the first managing editor of People magazine. Wow. But it was just a nice thing that she did. She didn't have to do it, but she was just a kind person. That's and awesome. So because of her, I launched my career as a writer.
Well, I'm grateful for her as well. One more question, then we're going to get to some audience questions. So 17 years passed between the publishing of that book and You Gotta Have Wa. How did your perception of Japanese baseball or the story you wanted to tell as it relates to baseball evolve during that time?
Well, it's 12 years. Chrysanthemum bat was 1977, and You Gotta Have Wa was 1989.
Thank you.
Well, I knew a lot. Chrysanthemum the Bat was written from the perspective of a fan, but I was sent back to Tokyo by Time Life, and the Japanese translation came out in Tokyo when I was there, and it became a bestseller. So the phone started ringing, and I started getting a lot of offers to write. And I honed my craft. I learned how to write. You know, Malcolm Gladwell has this thing about you spend 10,000 hours doing something and you become proficient at it, which is what I did, because I really didn't know how to write when I wrote Chrysanthemum the Bat. So I learned by doing this every day. I learned the ins and outs. And I spent a lot of time interviewing the players and going out to the ballpark. And by the time the opportunity for You Gotta Have Wah came around, I really knew my subject. You know, it wasn't just from the perspective of a baseball fan sitting in the stands or watching on TV. I knew everybody involved. I interviewed all the managers and the top players from each team. I knew the history. I knew the history going all the way back to the late 19th century when baseball was introduced. So I was much more equipped to do a book than I was when I did Chrysanthemum the Bat. And also the fact that the United States and Japan were involved in this huge trade dispute elevated interest in Japan. So You Gotta Have Wah became a bestseller in the States because of that.
Got it. All right. Well, we got a couple questions here, so I'm going to jump to Paul. You're up first.
Thanks, Shane. Bob, it's nice to meet you virtually. I actually just finished the book today. Started on Monday and finished it this morning. I found it very, very compelling read. But my question, you start out. I appreciate it because you got it into how the city transformed around leading up to the Olympics in the '64. And there was a part of the book, and maybe you sort of allude to it, but I'm not maybe misreading what you've written or the intent. But you talk about some of the warnings about the petty crime and whatnot, the pickpocketing and things like that people were warned about leading up to and during the '64 Olympics. And then right at the end of the book, you're talking about how honest the society is and how money is returned frequently, particularly after the Fukushima disaster. And that's the only Japan I've ever known, because the honesty and the cleanliness and so forth, because my first trip was in 2010. So is there something, was there a cultural event or something that happened to sort of transform the crime or the crime rate or the sort of the deportment of the Japanese people from pre-Olympics to what it is now, where it's inherently clean and very honest and helpful?
Well, there was a lot of crime in Japan after the war. You know, and the war ended, the Americans came in, occupied Japan for 6 years, and there were several 100,000 Japanese soldiers came back to Japan, and there were no jobs. And so people, gravitated towards the black markets. And so the gangs, like the Sumiyoshi gang, which is the largest gang in Tokyo, had, before the war, it was just a small gambling gang. It only had a few thousand members, and all of a sudden it had, like 80 or 90,000. The same with the Yamaguchi-gumi. There was there was no food. People were selling heirlooms and to rice farmers. They take the train out to the country and sell these expensive heirlooms just for a bag of rice. And so there was a lot of crime in the 50s, just because the city was so poor. And during the 40s, a lot of people starved to death. If it wasn't for American help, even more would have died. There's a lot of disease. The radios made periodic announcements during the 50s that for people to hide their butcher knives in the kitchen. So if robbers entered in the middle of the night, they couldn't use it as a weapon, that sort of thing. There was this a priest, Catholic priest that I knew who told me when he first came in 1958, he and the other priests were warned not to walk across Wayne Park at night because it was so dangerous. There were so many robbers. But the Olympics sort of purified all that. Japan became an economic superpower after the Olympics. And people had money. There was this income doubling plan by the end of the 60s, double the GNP and double the personal income of everybody. And so, crime wasn't necessary to survive for the average person. You didn't have to steal. Because I don't want to go over the occupation era again, but when the Americans came in September 1st, 1945, half of Tokyo was just flattened, was burned to the ground. There were, people were living in these big holes in the middle of the street made by the B-29 bombs, and they'd get some big metal sheet and put it over the hole, and that's where people lived. It was really, really bad. And so, the Olympics marked not only the physical and economic recovery of the Japanese, but I think the spiritual, psychological recovery. And there's a law I'm not sure when it started, but there's something called the lost goods law in Japan. If you pick up something, whether it's cash or anything, somebody's wallet, you're required by law to take it to the nearest koban or police box. And, of course, if nobody sees you, there's 10,000 yen laying on the ground. Nobody's around, you pick it up and put it in your pocket, but there's education system in Japan. In primary schools, the teachers will tell the kids, well, maybe somebody had a sick cat and you took the cat to the vet, but he dropped 10,000 yen on the way. And so the cat died, and that's your fault because you took his 10,000 yen. That kind of thing. So there's this awareness. And even now, every year it's like $35 million worth of lost cash is turned in Japan. It's amazing. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, it's sort of what I expected, but I like to hear it from somebody with a lot more experience in the country than me. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. All right, Charlie, you're up next.
Oh, thank you, Shane. Hi, Bob.
Hi.
I'm really glad that you discovered your writing destiny, because I really enjoyed the books of yours that I've read, especially You Gotta Have Wa. That was my introduction to Japanese baseball. And that was very educational and entertaining. And also finished Tokyo Junkie, and that was absolutely great fun read. And I found your life to be absolutely fascinating. So it would be great if they made a movie about your life and your opportunity to view the incredible transformation of Tokyo over that span, because I think it's an incredibly unique perspective. I have a question related more recent topics about Tokyo. Earlier this year, there's with the corona and everything, of course, the Olympics got postponed. And earlier this year, I said, especially on overseas media outlets, there were a lot of reporting that all of the Japanese citizens are against the Olympics. They want them canceled. And, there's some numbers like over 80% of Japanese want the Olympics canceled and all of that. I live in Japan, I'm in Saitama, but I never got that sense. I always sense, like many things here, more apathy than anything else. If the games move forward, that's great. If they don't, that's great. We'll get by either way. And so you're in the heart of Tokyo. I wanted to get your opinion. Did you think that type of reporting was, that storyline was overplayed, or do you think that there was some accuracy to those reports?
Well, there's been a lot of surveys, leading up to the Olympics, and anywhere from 60 to 80% of the people wanted the games either postponed or canceled outright, because people are upset that the government imposes this state of emergency and tells them to stay home and closes the bars, and you can't get a beer anywhere in town. At the same time, they're hosting Olympics when, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people, 11,000 athletes, 8,000 workers, and 20, and I see different numbers anyway, 60, 70,000 people are coming, auxiliary staff or whatever. So that's what people were upset. And I thought it's interesting how the government, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, just ignored all that. And it tells you who's really running the country, and who's running the country is Dentsu, the Keidan Ren, the Business Association, the people who came up with this Go to Travel and Go to Eat program, which just exploded the coronavirus cases. And Nihon Kaigi, this crazy right-wing group, that doesn't want Japan to suffer humiliation by having to cancel the games. And even the emperor voiced concern about holding the Olympics, but the LDP said, sorry, can't do it. It's amazing. So, now the Olympics is interesting. The competition is always fascinating to watch, and you get hooked on it. And so that's what's happening in Tokyo right now. But they just set an all-time record of corona cases 2 days ago, 3,800. And the government official only is talking about possible cancellation of the Paralympics because of this coronavirus. So, people are happy to see Japan succeed in the Olympics. They're leading the gold medal count the last I saw, but they're really not happy about the state of emergency. And the government is really dragging its feet on these vaccinations. And I think that's because of the influence of the big pharmaceutical companies in Japan. They want in on the action. They want their own vaccine. So, yeah, I think most people think like me. I really like watching the Olympics, and I'm really mad at the government because they allowed the Olympics to continue without vaccinating the nation. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Got it.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for joining too. All right, Sanjay, you're up next.
Hi, Bob-san.
Hey, Sanjay, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm great.
You've given me a chance to go back and read all your older books as well. So it's been a lot of fun during the pandemic, really. Thank you for that. My question is, you alluded to Tokyo Junkie being maybe serialized on TV or something of that nature at the little chat before we started officially. But I'm wondering, do you have any plans for it to be translated into Japanese? Because my wife won't read the English version.
Well, it started out, I did the Japanese first.
Oh, really?
I wrote a series in 2014 for the Japan Times called about the Olympics, 25,000 words, 64 Olympics and leading up to the run up to the 2020 games. And Kadokawa asked me to turn it into a memoir, which I did. And it turned out to be really, really hard, very difficult undertaking. I think it's the hardest kind of writing to do as a memoir. Anyway, I wound up with 177,000 words, which was twice the size of a normal book. It's twice as big as You Gotta Have Wa or Tokyo Underworld. And they published it as is. And then when I talked to an American publisher, they said 100,000 words is the limit. So I had to go back and redo it and cut it and change some things for an American audience. So the name of the Japanese version is Futatsu no Olympiku, 2 Olympics. And Kadokawa publishes it. You can get it online. It's big, thick book. It's expensive.
That's awesome. I wasn't aware of that, but thank you. I've written it down and I'm gonna get it in Japanese as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Sanjay. All right, Michael Leeds, you're up next.
Thank you. It's good to see you again, Bob.
How are you?
Saw you when we were living in Japan.
Right.
I'm wondering to turn maybe more directly to baseball and how it stands currently in Japan. And you mentioned that the Giants were everything in Japan for many, many years. But it seems like they've been displaced by the Hawks. And is that something that's just they're the new team, they're the new dominant team in baseball in Japan, or is this just part of the ebb and flow?
Well, they've won, what is it, the last 5 or 6 Japan series. So the record is 9 held by the Giants. I think they just have a better, more sophisticated organization. Marty Keenert is on this group tonight. He could probably give you a better answer. But I just think they have smarter people running the organization. Sadaharu has been their top guy for a long time in the front office. And plus, I think they have a better, scouting program, player development program. I don't know what, Yomiuri has always been able to take advantage of the free agent system. Some guy, domestic free agency ends after 8 years here now. And so they'll always sign the top free agents, guys in their, later years of their career, around 30, early 30s. And that's what they've relied on to keep their, franchise going, but it hasn't worked very well. I think they need a better player development system. But I've sort of, Japanese baseball has disappeared from primetime television in Japan. That's one big thing. It's the new generation of people that happened, started to happen back during the 90s. When I was going to school and living in Japan in the 80s, there was something like 25 million people watched the Yomiuri Giants games on TV every night. That's, was a 20-25% share or something like that. And now it dropped down to single digits in the 90s. And the younger generation doesn't have the patience for it. So they're once a week or something like that. I haven't really counted, but occasionally you see primetime baseball on NHK or Yomiuri television. But it's mostly moved to cable, and they don't have the audience like ESPN has, or the Dodgers or the Yankees, the Yes Network. They don't have anywhere near the kind of audience. It's only a few, maybe a few 100,000 people. But the thing that's interesting development is in recent years, attendance has gone up. We used to have 23 million people a year. Now it's 26. And people like to go and sit in the Oendan and cheering groups and yell their heads off. And the Oendan, the cheering groups have expanded. It used to be just in the outfield. Now you see them in the, part of the infield as well. So it's interesting development. All right.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael, for that question. I guess you kind of alluded to it in that question. I want to ask you to expand. Like, what do you view as the health of the Japanese game and the outlook on it? Like, I know you said it's kind of struggling in some ways. Do you foresee that continuing, or is it always going to be around, or potentially growing back to its past status?
Well, I think it's the success of Otani and Darvish, Tanaka in the big leagues it keeps interest in baseball alive in this country. High school kids see that, or kids are starting out and approach little league age. They see Otani on TV and they want to be just like him. So, that it's healthy for the development of the game. The problem with Japanese baseball is that the teams are run by corporations that they don't approach them as profit-making businesses like the Americans do. It's just a PR vehicle for the parent company, like Nippon Ham Fighters exists to basically to promote the sales of pork. Yomiuri Giants to promote the newspaper, Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper, that kind of thing. So they don't have the minor league development system that the Americans do. So that's always been the difference between the two. But, they have really healthy high school and college baseball systems. So they'll always be generating good players. So, I think it'll just go on like it is now. I don't think it'll change much.
Got it. Thanks. All right, Eureka, you're up.
Okay, this kind of is adding on to what you're talking about, but it sounds like the younger generation is maybe losing patience for baseball, which is of course happening here too. But Mashi always talks about how he thinks it's disappointing in Japan because there's not the kind of respect paid in Japan to the history and the legacy of baseball as there is here. And I saw, and I was like heartened that during the torch ceremony, they had Sadahara O and Nagashima and Matsui were together being part of the legacy. And I thought that was nice, but apparently there's just not the kind of, so I'm curious about your take on this, because apparently during the broadcast, they basically just do the play-by-play and they talk about the player that just made the hit or whatever, and there isn't the tendency that where they might say, oh, so-and-so just made a hit that looked just like Nagashima, or that someone is pitching exactly the same way as somebody. There isn't the connection to the past, and Marcy thinks it's kind of disappointing, and it seems to me like it sounds like there's a lack of cultural connection through the generations of like looking back to the history of baseball, and apparently that is also somewhat true with the kind of parent-child generational thing. Although I would imagine that if someone is a really big baseball fan and you're raising your kid, you might bring up certain players. But I'm curious what you think about that and about how much that does or doesn't play into the growth of the sport ongoingly.
Well, the high school baseball tournament in the summer, the National High School Baseball Championship Tournament held at Koshien Stadium, 2 weeks. 49 teams, single elimination. That's telecast live every day from morning till night. Everything stops. You see the support groups travel to Koshien State when there's no COVID anyway. It's like a big national festival. Everybody stops and watches, the semifinals and the finals. You can see lots of documentaries during that time about the Koshin heroes of the past, like Ota Koji, Daisuke Araki, Masahiro Tanaka, Yuki Saito. People know these names. And everybody knows who Sadaharu O is. I mean, so, there are periodic documentaries on television about baseball and the history. So it's the younger generation doesn't have the patience because they're raised on video games, and they want something that's really fast moving and fast paced. So that's, I think, has accounted for the disappearance of professional baseball on network television. The Yomiuri Giants used to make $100 million a year just on, TV telecasts of Giants games. That's basically gone. But, on the other hand, there's an increase in physical attendance at the games. People like it. It's like going to, neighborhood festival, to go to the ballpark and sit there in the Owen Down and yell your head off for 3 hours, scream as loud as you can. It's one way that this in society in Japan, releasing all this emotional energy inside. The Japanese baseball game is a little bit different than going to Dodger Stadium or Yankee Stadium, where everybody has his own individual stick, and you're sitting in the infield. You can stand up and yell, "Kill the umpire" or whatever, and nobody thinks anything of it. But not in Japan. It's considered bad manners, and you're disturbing the peace of the people around you. So if you want to scream and yell, then you go out where the cheering group is, and you become part of that, and you can yell all night. So, I think, I don't see baseball dying out. I think it's healthy, not like it used to be, but it's still there. And if you see the surveys and these periodic surveys of the most popular sport in Japan, professional baseball is still up there around 60%. Maybe it used to be 70%, but it's still 60% is pretty healthy. And 40% would cite high school baseball as their favorite sport. And then after that, it's soccer. Sumo might be making a comeback after this last tournament. But baseball is still alive and well, relatively speaking.
Are the younger people also attending the games?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah, they do. Right? It's a good place to take your girlfriend on a date, I've been told. I live in Toyosu, and I'm right across the park right across the way from a baseball park, a park where baseball is being played. Right now, as I'm looking out the window, there are 2 games going on, 2 Little League games, and they do this all year. They start right after New Year's, around January the 4th, every Saturday and Sunday. They're out here playing all day. So it looks okay to me.
Good.
Thanks, Eureka. I was curious about that question about the history too, so thanks for asking that. I'm going to do one more audience question here, and then we're going to have a pre-programmed quick little break for just a 3-minute stretch or bathroom break. So, Stephen, you're up. You're up next.
Awesome. Sorry, I joined a little bit late, so forgive me if this question's been asked already. But I think just speaking to the live element of the game and how it's becoming more popular, attendance is rising. I'm just curious, Robert, from your perspective, and I know Shane's the expert here leading people on tours across Japan to see baseball games, but of all the different stadiums that you've attended, and the live baseball events that you've been to, what stands out as a memorable one for a Westerner and getting the full experience? I suppose Tokyo Dome is sort of the centerpiece of baseball, but you know, there's all sorts of some great stadiums and kind of unique experiences. So just curious of your take on that.
Well, I always liked Meiji Jingu. It's an outdoor stadium, and it's got history. It's where Babe Ruth played in 1934. It dates back to the late, I forget the exact year, but the late 1920s or something like that, early 1930s it was built. Has a long history. I don't like the Tokyo Dome. It's like watching baseball inside a jumbo jet. There's something wrong with the air. And I have a long history with the Tokyo Dome. The Giants, when it was first opened in 1987, the Giants claimed it had a capacity of 56,000 people. And they would announce capacity crowds every night. They'd flash it on the scoreboard, and this would be shown on television. And I was asked by the editor of the Shukan Asahi magazine, where I was writing a column, to check the attendance. So I counted the seats, and there was 42,761 seats. And I counted the standing crowd with another Japanese reporter, and there were 3,300 people standing. So that's about 46,000. As a matter of fact, in the lower basement of the dome, the third level of the basement in the dome, there's a sign put up by the fire department that says the capacity 46,134. So here we have the Yomiuri Giants, who are owned by the world's largest newspaper, dedicated to truth and justice and objectivity, lying about the attendance every year. They did this until 2004. When the laws were changed, the tax laws, and the teams had to start paying tax on the attendance they announced, not what they really had. So suddenly the Giants' attendance went from 56,000 to 46,000. But I wrote an article about that in the Shukan Asahi, and I was banned from the stadium for writing that. So I had some mixed feelings.
That's amazing. Thanks, Steve, for that question. So, Bob, I wanted to ask you a question that that is a theme that we bring up on most of our calls. So you obviously focus, a lot of your work is through the eyes of import players in Japan, and you're an import player of sorts in your own way. What have you observed to be the common traits of those who thrive in Japan, in baseball and otherwise? As a foreigner, I should clarify.
Well, it helps to learn the language. You really should learn to speak Japanese, learn to read it, if not write it, but learn to read it at least. And I don't know if there's any magic formula. Perseverance, humility, a sense of humor. If you want to live in this country for long term, it's imperative to get out every year. My wife and I have a house in California, and we spend 6 weeks in the winter and 6 weeks in the summer. And I'm always happy to leave Japan and get back there. And after 6 weeks, I can't wait to get back to Tokyo. I periodically go to New York, for long periods. We would rent an apartment in Paris. And so I spent a lot of time in Europe and New York City. And I can say without a doubt that Tokyo is the best of all. It's a civilized state, it really is. A crime rate, all the metrics are. Tokyo is number one in so many different metrics. Got the highest GDP, the largest population, more Fortune 500 global headquarters here, more Michelin-starred restaurants, twice as many 3-star Michelin restaurants as Paris, the lowest crime rate, fashion conscious, highest life expectancy, highest literacy rate, blah, blah, blah. So global finance rated it the most livable city in the world last year in November, amid the COVID crisis. So it's a really great city, and I'm really happy I'm here. And I don't know if there's a formula for success. You just have to. It's like anything. You just have to keep at it. Don't give up. Pick something out and go for it. You just don't give up until you reach your goal. I always liked Jim Lefever's advice to people who can't come to Japan, to baseball, American baseball players who arrive in Japan to play baseball. He says, forget you ever played in the big leagues. Just pretend you're a rookie at, Dodger camp and go from there. Just do everything they do. Don't. Or Darrell Spencer, who said, to succeed in Japan, says you have to learn to think backwards. He said that means just do everything the opposite of what you would do in the States. That means arrive early for practice, don't argue with the coaches, never complain, never swing at the first pitch, and don't play practical jokes on your teammates. Do that and you'll be fine.
That's good advice from them and from you. I like that. So I mean, clearly you have a love affair with the city, and the persistence you mentioned of keeping at it to make it successful. But why now to write a memoir after all this time?
Well, I never thought about writing a memoir. Kadokawa just asked me to do it. This big Japanese publisher who published my other books, Tokyo Underworld and You Gotta Have Wall. And it was really, really hard. It took like 4 years to do it. Because the problem with writing a memoir is you're basically interviewing yourself, and you don't know whether you're asking the right questions or getting the right answers for yourself, because the tendency is to make yourself look good. And you have to fight that. And also you don't really know what's interesting. If I'm writing a straight nonfiction book, I know what readers will respond to and what they won't. But when it comes to my own life, I have no idea what is going to attract the reader. So that's why I wrote twice as much as any other book, because I figured that the editors would take out the stuff that wasn't interesting and then leave me with a normal sized book. But then they faked me out by publishing the whole thing. But it's so I wouldn't do it again. It's too hard. I'm glad it's out of the way.
Got it. What would you have said if I told the 19-year-old Bob Whiting that almost 60 years later he'd be writing a memoir about his 6 decades in Japan and many books written about his time in Japan?
I wouldn't have believed you. I figured that I would go back after military. I go back and resume my college education. I go to some state university in California and either become a sports writer for some newspaper, or maybe a computer programmer or something like that. That's what I'd envisioned for myself. It just worked out completely different.
I'm glad it did. I want to go back to You Gotta Have Law. Like when you were working on that, I know you said you felt like you had refined your writing style. Like, did you know when you're writing it, like you were onto something good, and did its success and has its staying power caught you off guard at all?
No, not really, because it was grounded in history for one thing, and it was. about half the book had already been published in Sports Illustrated. I had published 2 or 3 of those chapters at various times in Smithsonian and something in Time magazine. So I knew from the response, when from the editors at Sports Illustrated and the people who write in the letters to the editor comments, that this stuff was good. And so when I finished, all I had to do was basically write 6 new chapters. And so I just had to make those as good as the others, as the best I could. So I wasn't sure it would be a bestseller, no. But that was just luck, I think, because because of the trade disputes had really heated up, and Japan was buying up Columbia Studios and Rockefeller Center. So it just came out at the right time. But I'd always thought that You Gotta Have Wallace the best book of all the books that I've done. Until this one, Tokyo Junkie. I'm not sure. I have to wait a little while and gain some perspective.
Well, I know that in promoting this episode, at least more than one person has said that they thought this most recent one was the best one, or at least their favorite. So there's some good early feedback for you.
Oh, great.
If anyone has questions out there, please let me know in the chat or raising your hand. Other than Sanjay wants to know, when are you coming to Honolulu?
When am I going to get out of Japan? I'm trapped here.
Yeah. You're trying to get out and we're trying to get in.
I don't know. Now they had all-time high of 3,800 cases in Tokyo. So I'm not sure if they're, what's going to happen. I was going to go back in September, but now with this Delta variant, I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Keith's got his hand raised. Keith, you're up.
I think I'm unmuted, am I?
Yep, we can hear you.
I just wanted to say during the break, I ran upstairs to my study and found my copy of the Chrysanthemum and the Bad. I purchased this paperback in 1983. I think I've read it 3 times over the years. Go back to it periodically. I've enjoyed all your writings. I'm curious what your future plans are. Are you planning to stay in Japan, or you have any other book projects in mind? I'm curious as a member of your reading public.
Yeah, I've got my wife and I will just continue our routine when this COVID pandemic passes, which is the winter and summer in the States or Europe, and spring and fall in Japan. And I've finished a draft of another book. It's called Tokyo Outsiders. It's a sequel to Tokyo Underworld. And it's about a lot of nefarious underworld creatures that I've met over the years. So I handed that off to an editor to see if they can fix some of the problems. So we'll see what happens. But I think that'll be out next year sometime.
Very good. I'm curious, are you able to get vaccinated in Japan as a foreigner? Is that a problem, or?
No, I'm a resident. I'm a permanent resident of Japan. Okay. So my wife and I got vaccinated last month. We got our 2 shots. We got the COVID, or not the COVID, the Pfizer shots.
All right. Very good. Thank you. I might say, I agree with you. The first game I ever went to in Japan, I haven't been to very many, was at Meiji Jingu Stadium. And I went as just an adjunct to a regular Japanese tour I was on. They had asked whether or not anyone had special requests, and I had looked up and saw there was a game there on a Sunday when this tour group was in town. And my wife and I and one other couple went to the game there. It was the Hiroshima Carp versus the Swallows. I didn't know what to expect. And I'll always remember, for me, I'll always remember it was like the 7th inning or so. All of a sudden, these thousands of umbrellas appear out of nowhere, and these folks all sitting around me
right, yeah,
do their song. And I had never seen such a thing before, and it just blew me away. And I'll always remember that as my first and sort of my epiphany of what goes on in Japan. I thought that was just beautiful.
What year was that?
That was about 4 years ago.
Yeah,
So
that's
you know,
their.
I hadn't seen one umbrella, and all of a sudden there's just thousands of them around me, all different sizes, and they're all singing together in unison. You know, you'd never see that at an American game. It just caught me completely off guard, and it was just wonderful.
Yeah, the Yakult is famous for that, the umbrella Owen Don. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. And Keith, that book, I was looking on Amazon, and it's listed for $775. You could sell that and pay for your next trip to Japan if you want.
It's in virtually mint condition, except
Yeah, it looks good.
I did a lot of underlining in places where you listed the various articles and what their protocols and so forth. I underlined it like a student, so maybe I ruined the value of it somewhat. Not that I plan to sell it.
Yeah.
Well, I have about 200 of these books here. So if anybody wants one, just send me an email and an address, and you can have it cheap. It's in good condition, mint condition.
All right.
I may have to take you up on that. All right. It looks like that's it for the questions. So I wanted to point out, Steve, I see you wearing the mask. Oh, I got spotlight, Steve. Yeah, if you don't have it yet, there's your JapanBall mask. Masks are coming back, it looks like, all over the place. So JapanBall.com, shameless plug. If you want to get a JapanBall mask. Thanks for showing that off, Steve. I wanted to show Sean Kane was wearing an awesome Tigers jersey, but I think he had to leave early. But anyway, so I'm going to wrap things up here. I actually have to run because my brother is having an album release party. He's a music producer. But it's great having all you on. And Bob, it was really nice to meet you. I really appreciate you answering those questions and taking the time. We had a pretty good showing here, and a lot of people actually told me they're going to be watching afterwards for one reason or another. With things opening up here in the US, at least, people's Friday nights are taken these days. But that was a real fun time. And I just wanted to, I noticed a couple of new faces here, so I just wanted to real quickly again show our social media handles and whatnot. 1 second. Please follow us online and send me an email if you have any questions or any ideas for future guests, and sign up for a newsletter, JapanBall.com, for anyone who's new here. Yeah, thanks again for joining. I'll probably, as you guys have seen, for you regulars, I'm doing these a little bit less frequently nowadays. But you know, as the good guests come in, I'm definitely going to be doing more chatter up. So hopefully I'll see you on a future episode. Thanks again for joining us, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of JapanBall's Chatter Up. For more content like this and other videos related to international baseball, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And to learn more about our international baseball tours and everything else JapanBall has to offer, check out JapanBall.com and sign up for our newsletter there. Thank you, and I'll see you at the ballpark.